Welcome back to South Hampstead for another episode, riveting episode, all the way from Israel of our foreign correspondent. There you go. The scene is set.
Richard, very nice to meet you, and very nice to find the very close contacts that we have, unbeknown to me until this moment. Really looking forward to talking tonight. I know that you have been very involved with Israel for many years, and the various positions that you've held in the Prime Minister's office, your current position as Director of BICOM in Israel. This is not specifically a program about BICOM, although I hope that we'll have an opportunity to speak about some of the work that BICOM does as we a little bit later on. This is really an opportunity for us to be able to gain some further insights into some of the things which are happening in Israel at the moment on the political front, some of the big decisions which have to be confronted, etc. And we're turning to you for your understanding, for your insights, for your in-depth knowledge, etc., to try and help us to understand some of the things which sometimes from a distance just simply are much more difficult to make sense of, particularly in the labyrinthian kinds of political situation that you have in Israel. So let's start, Richard, tonight, and we'll come back a little bit more to you later on, but let's go straight in to start with. And it's been a pretty torrid time in Israel, with 3 elections over 18 months. At least at last, now there is a government. Can you just talk us through the nature of this coalition, the relationship between Bibi and Benny, the involvement of blue and white, and how this whole thing coalesces and finally comes together? Over to you.
Okay, I hope you can hear me now.
We can.
Great. Okay, first of all, Rabbi, thank you very much indeed for having me in for,
one correction.
For all of you.
I'm just Shlomo. I'm calling you by your first name, you call me by my first name. That's the rules of engagement. Right.
Okay, very good, noted. And thank you all, everyone else, for joining us as well. And as Shlomo said, I hope to hear your questions and really talk about what's interesting you. So if we start off and talk about the kind of the government formation, I suppose, and kind of how it came about. As you mentioned, we had 3 basically inconclusive government elections here through 2019, and the last one in March earlier this year. The truth is that result was also inconclusive. When I say inconclusive, it refers to the fact that usually Israeli governments are built up by the blocs. It's not about one party, it's about getting over the magic 61 mark of the 120 House of the Knesset, and neither left or right-wing bloc was able to achieve that this time round. It was actually Benny Gantz who was given the first opportunity to form the government, given the mandate by President Rivlin, and he did that by 2 extreme and incompatible forces, both the Joint Arab List and Israel Beitenu, the secular hawk on the right wing. That was what changed between September and March. Both of them gave their mandate to Benny Gantz to form the government. However, as I mentioned, they were incompatible to sit in the same government, and they wouldn't even kind of support a minority government from the outside either. So that left Benny Gantz only with the only choice was to enter into a national unity government with Netanyahu to avoid a 4th election. And from Netanyahu's perspective, similarly, he almost got there on the right-wing bloc. They were just a few seats shy. So you had this formulation of an agreement. Obviously, conveniently, around then came the Corona crisis, which added a very useful ladder to climb down the tree for both sides, because obviously Benny Gantz had campaigned that he wouldn't sit with a prime minister who was under indictment, i.e. Netanyahu, and though he changed that kind of central core message from the election campaign and went against it because the coronavirus was enough. Either, I mean, if you're cynical, I'd say it was a ladder and an excuse, or it was a genuine crisis that need to instill a national unity. Now, if you look at the coalition agreement they signed, unlike previous coalition agreements for previous prime ministers, I remember in particular Arik Sharon, when he formed a government, he didn't care what the coalition said. He used to sign a blank piece of paper and give his emissaries and told them to sign up whoever they could, because for him, as soon as he was prime minister and had that governing coalition, that was it, done deal. He knew he could rule and do it his way. So it didn't really matter what the coalition really thought about it. This is very different. This is a very legalistic, detailed document. and speaks to the lack of trust on both sides. That a lot of the agreement is built around what would one side do if the other renegade on the deal, and who would become then the sitting prime minister going into an election campaign. We're 3 weeks in, so far so good. It's held. The other kind of interesting factor, what made this government unique, is that it has created a new status of alternate prime minister, APM, and that's obviously Benny Gantz at the moment, with 18 months in November 2021. He is due to take over as prime minister, but in the moment they have a government of parity, where unlike in the usual Israeli, we don't have a constitution, but the usual constitutional law would state that the prime minister has the right to sack any of his ministers. In this case, it's divided, that half the cabinet is responsible to the Likud party and to Netanyahu, and half the cabinet is responsible to Gantz and to the blue and white faction, even though the disparity in numbers is quite stark. There are 54 members of the right-wing bloc of the government and only 19 on the blue and white side, which is made up of 4 from blue and white, 2 from the Derech Eretz faction, and 2 from the Labour faction. As ridiculous as it sounds, you've got a three-person Labour party, 2 of whom are in the government and 1 of whom are in the opposition, and they still remain in the same.
It could only happen in Israel.
Absolutely, absolutely.
This is very fascinating, and I would like to take this a bit further, but if you don't mind, I want to step back a little bit, because
sure.
I just wonder, how did the country manage without a government for all of that time? There must have been some terrible lacunas. There must have been areas of national interest, of services of some kind or another, that was simply neglected during that time. This is not something which people have focused on, but I'm very fascinated to hear what was it that fell between the cracks during the time of an absence of a stable government.
Well, I'll answer it first in a slightly different way and tell you what didn't fall between the cracks. And that was kind of the most, as you can imagine, the most important value here, which is the issue of security. That there is, despite the lack of a government for over 500 days, the security establishment, the IDF, the Shin Bet security service, and the Mossad have basically established a modus operandi and a way to run, obviously in close coordination with the government, but that was to its credit kind of left unhindered by the government. I think there are 2 main problems that happen when you don't have a government. One is the lack of budgets. With the last budget was actually passed, a 2-year budget at the end of 2017. So what we're working on from the whole of and that was for 18 and 19. And so from the start of January 2020, they were working on a budget that was created over 2 years previously and was proportional, divided into 12 and split into the months. Now, I think the biggest casualty in those cases are the weakest sectors in society. That's really who suffered. They were the weakest sectors in society. Those that rely on social welfare payments, the disabled, the elderly, children at risk, where there were basically, unfortunately, money running out to run the proper services that should be there to look after those weakest sectors. And I think they really lost out. Ironically,
what were the social consequences of that? Where did you see evidence of that in society?
I think we saw evidence of that across kind of the health and the education sector. Certainly, there were cases of within the welfare sector of not being able to back up and to give the support that they should have in crude financial terms. I would say as well, but there is obviously, as you and lots of the audience will know, there is a healthy third sector within Israeli society that works, that picks up. There are some fantastic organizations doing great work that kind of fill in and share with the government's responsibility, so that I don't think that I wouldn't have called it a crisis, but it was a crisis in management and the idea of being able to do some serious forward planning. And that goes not just across the welfare sector, but across a whole range of other projects as well.
And when you say that security was intact, the bigger strategic picture of relationships, the building relationships with other countries in the Middle East, all that work that has been going on in the past, the foreign relations with other countries, relationships with Russia, with China, what impact did the absence of a government have on those broader strategic considerations?
Well, I don't think the lack of the government had such a problem in those fields, because I think a lot of those relationships are centralized around Netanyahu, for good or for bad, and there are pros and cons in that relationship. But certainly when it comes to, for example, Russia, who is the kind of, from the security perspective here, is neighbor basically, because they now sit as part of the in Syria, and there is a very sophisticated and high level of what they call deconfliction mechanism that exists with the Russians at the moment, to allow the Israeli Air Force to operate in the skies there, and to follow through in the doctrine that was actually set up by the previous Chief of Staff, Gadi Eisenkot. It's got the Hebrew acronym BAMAM, Nivtza Beina Milchama, kind of the operations between the wars, which means that kind of that the Israel's vital interests were protected. Obviously, that goes the same with the US, and with the what's referred to as kind of the covert relations with the Arab world. That's a mixture of kind of Netanyahu and the security establishment. You should remember that Netanyahu is particularly close with Yossi Cohen, the current head of the Mossad. In fact, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he was asked a few months ago about his successor, he didn't name any of the current Likud MKs. He suggested that the two people, Yossi Cohen, the head of the Mossad, and Ron Dermer, his ambassador in the US, would be potential successors. I mean, that's not to say any of that would happen, but just as a future mark going forward, that kind of he puts a lot of faith and trust in those inner people around him.
Mm. All right, let's that was a deviation. Let's come back to the current situation. So Benny Gantz joins the government. He has to eventually backtrack on one of his fundamental principles of the basis upon which he would be prepared to share government. In the process, he loses half of his support base. What's the strategy? What's the reason for doing that? That's a big risk, and it comes at a very, very high political price.
Absolutely. Well, I think the jury is still out of whether it was the right move or not. As I said, he saw this as part of he would argue, part of national responsibility to avoid going into a fourth election. But there was no other way, and the fact that it split the party was a sad byproduct of that, of showing national responsibility. Although he'll also argue, as I mentioned before, that he managed at the same time of splitting the party. They were 33. He's now gone in with 15 plus 2, 17. He was still able, almost every single member of his party is to become a minister. I didn't mention that we have an enormously large, bloated cabinet, the largest ever, 34 ministers, a slew of deputy ministers as well. And so he was able to do the deal by talking about national responsibility and bringing, from his perspective, kind of bringing the goods in terms of the ministerial portfolios. I would add that the most important things that he held on to, as well as this title of alternate prime minister, he is now the defense minister as well. Gabi Ashkenazi, another former chief of staff. Yeah.
Do you buy his argument? Do you buy his explanation? Are you persuaded by it, or is this just about the desperate need for power to be able to play a part in the government, to be able to have the chance at being a prime minister? Is this real national?
Well, I think this.
Or is it just political?
Well, I mean, it's definitely a bit of both. I'll tell it like this. In hindsight, it's easier to be a little bit more cynical. If you cast your mind back just after Purim and kind of towards the middle of March, when the coronavirus here at least was just breaking out, then there was a genuine concern. How can you possibly, and how can you risk going to a fourth election dealing with this pandemic? So at that moment, it seemed like genuine responsibility. However, what then followed was kind of a return to classic Israeli politics with brinkmanship, that it took over a month after that to form the government. So people are saying, well, either it's about a national emergency, therefore you do the deal and you don't need to work out such a complicated agreement, or it's about kind of securing the judges selection committee, which was one of the kind of the stalling points over the coalition agreement, which was then, by the way, challenged in the High Court and adapted. So I think it's a bit of both, but I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt that both in terms of his own personal political ambition and national responsibility, there was a coalescing of opportunities there that led to the government.
With a very cynical and weary electorate, do you think that they buy his story?
Well, I'll say two things that will slightly contradict each other. The first is that the country is clearly very divided. There are some that see. I mean, first of all, all these elections, all three, can in certain sense be about a single referendum on Netanyahu's appropriateness to continue as prime minister. And just under half the country, because also you have to take into effect that the Haredi parties, for example, the ultra-Orthodox parties, were unashamedly backing Netanyahu all the way, as were the Yamina party of Naftali Bennett. They didn't go into the coalition in the end, and we can talk about that if you like. But half the country was clearly with him, whilst half the country are, to some degree or another, either vehemently against him and think that that the guy needs to end up in prison, or just kind of we've had enough and that we wanted an alternative. So that's one kind of prism to look at Israeli politics. The other is that there is a large, broad consensus of kind of 70-80% represented by this government that just had enough of the election cycle, which by essence kind of draws out the worst in people and highlights the fusions and the divisions within society. But in broad strokes, there is a general consensus of Middle Israel, both voting for and against Israel, that are generally satisfied that wanted a national government as a result, and are broadly, I wouldn't say satisfied, because again, the large bloated government leaves a bad taste in the mouth, but at least we've avoided the fourth election.
So it sounds as if in overall terms he earns kudos for having done the right thing, and at last there is at least a government, even if it's a bloated one.
I think so. I'll just make one more point. We've seen a couple of polls come out over just the last few days. In fact, we had another one this evening. Now, I'm personally very skeptical about these polls, and I really wouldn't put too much weight in them, because they're basically irrelevant until an election is called and you can see where the trends are going in the polls. But there's no doubt that that was what I've described as perhaps a more flattering version of events. That the party of blue and white has fallen down to 12 seats in these polls, whilst the Likud has shot up to close to 40. And Yesh Atid Telem, the half of the blue and white that didn't enter the government, is only doing slightly better on 14 seats. So if you even take them together, 26 is a substantial fall from 33. And it shows in itself that the blue and white electorate were themselves divided over whether it was the right thing or not for him to enter into this government.
I want to take another slight detour in our narrative over here, because we wanted to move forward to some other events. But coronavirus was one of the powerful reasons that was given as an excuse, or it might very well have been the right reason for this government to come together. Just talk us through your perspective and perhaps the view of the Israeli electorate in regard to the way in which coronavirus has been handled by the government.
So I think the government did relatively well, at least early on. They were quite decisive in kind of shutting the country down significantly by air travel far ahead of most countries, and also kind of closing other parts of the economy down. Obviously, the other side of the coin of that is that Israel is suffering and is continuing to suffer from a serious economic slowdown, and that's kind of being polite. In very crude terms, at the beginning of March, the unemployment rate was 3.6%, and by the end of March, it was over 27%. which is obviously a hugely dramatic effect on the Israeli economy. So these. I mean, I presume similar to the UK and other countries are grappling with the dynamic of the health provisions as opposed to what's good for the economy, and we're still seeing that today. That's kind of being fought out in the cabinet. So broadly, in terms of the health, Israel has done incredibly well. Less than 300 deaths in total, under 20,000 people infected. During the first wave, so I'll talk about in a second what's happening at the moment. But in the first wave, there were three exceptions to the success of Israel dealing with it. One was in the ultra-Orthodox communities, again probably straight after Purim parties, and especially in areas like Bnei Barak, which was significantly affected. Another was in the old age homes. That's, I think, a trend across the world. And despite having shut down air travel, there was still flights coming in, particularly from America, and not everyone then was being asked to go and quarantine themselves in one of these Corona hotels as they were meant to. They were being allowed to go free, and that was also a problematic element of it.
Yes, I read
one other positive aspect of.
Sorry, just to interrupt. I read a really fascinating, something which I'd actually never appreciated before, that unlike porous countries, islands like England, the United Kingdom, and other places, Israel has pretty much only one point of entry for the majority of people who visit the country, and that's Lud Airport, Ben Gurion. It just never occurred to me before that, you take for granted that in other countries you can come by ship, by truck, by bus, by plane, by train, etc. In Israel, it doesn't work that way. You've got one entry point, and you want to block it off, you've pretty much sealed the country off. Just
correct. We are an island.
Yeah,
we are an island, or as a former prime minister said, we're a jungle a villa in the jungle. But that's again another time. Okay. But I would just say another positive aspect of the corona was the role that the IDF played, particularly within two sectors of the population, with the ultra-Orthodox and also with the Israeli Arab communities. That for the first time they had direct contact with the IDF, who weren't armed and were there on kind of a humanitarian mission, and certainly did a great deal had a positive effect of showing both those population groups that were essentially cynical as to the role of the IDF, that they can deliver and they can be a force for good as well.
How fascinating. Is that a pointer for the future? Have we found, as so many people have found in coronavirus, in some of the positive ways in which we've changed behaviors and changed the things we've done that we do, does this point to possibly to another way of the IDF actually dealing with its dissident populations?
It's possible. I mean, I think there is. I think there is that, and also it was another fascinating aspect within the ultra-Orthodox world was what some people have, ultra-Orthodox commentators themselves, have been described kind of a speeding up of the process of modernization, of what they had kind of anticipated was going to take a decade or so, especially kind of in terms of people bringing internet connections into their homes and allowing televisions or radios to be on because of the necessity to follow the news. So that would be the catalyst for change was speeded up as a result of the coronavirus.
And I wonder, notwithstanding the terrible impact, negative impact on the economy, we've been reading quite a lot over here about, once again, the inventiveness and the creativity of Israeli high tech, etc. A number of companies are switching their startups, are switching across to solutions to make life better post coronavirus, during coronavirus, etc. A whole shift in the direction of startup companies. Does this perhaps herald a whole new wave of new invention, creativity, and profitability from Israeli companies, from high tech?
Well, I mean, it's as you know, Israel was already one of the world leaders in a whole range of high tech fields, and obviously medical technology was already one of those advanced fields. Listen, I think the game. This was said to me by a senior security official just a few days ago, and I think it's no secret that there is now a race on across the world of who's going to be the country and the body to find a cure here. And obviously Israel is very keen to be up in the running for that. Although the Prime Minister who visited the laboratories yesterday was cautioned to say that we're not there yet. I should add another aspect of the coronavirus was in the initial stages, the panic concern over an Italy type scenario where they would run out of ventilators. And again, I was given access to one of the senior officials in this National Security Council that was explaining to me that the number at the beginning of the virus, although they haven't said exactly, was thought to be around 3,500 units across the whole country, and they had set an objective to double that figure. And they were doubling that figure by two ways. One, by using, it was actually the Mossad that was put in charge of the procurement. They've since handed it back to the health ministry, but they were put in charge of procurement, and they were able to bring in about 1,000 extra ventilators with an order for another couple of thousand to come later in the year. And then, as you mentioned, there were other military industries that changed their factories. Instead of building armaments and weapons, that were refitted to be able to create and to build more ventilators as well. So the projection now is that by the end of the year, Israel will have about 10,000 or so ventilators. Obviously, we all hope that they won't be necessary. And in fact, at its height in the middle of April, they only had 140 people on ventilators at all. So we should caution that all of this, there are some sectors of society that are saying we're all getting way over concerned about this because it was always manageable. But in the worst case projection, and by the way, this brings me on to where we are tonight, because we're now in the concern that we are the beginning of a second wave of the virus. I know that my kids' schools have closed down just because of one child in the school in a different year happened to contract the disease. So there's a precaution. They shut down the school, and that's happening across Jerusalem and in other places as well. And there is concern that in the next 10 days or so, we will find ourselves in a much worse situation. The numbers for the first time since the end of April have kind of been growing exponentially. So there is a real concern that we may not be out of the woods yet.
Have you found, as we have found here in England, that as the lockdown was relaxed, people basically flaunted it. As soon as a little bit of leeway was given, people just have gone out, particularly young people, and they've completely and totally ignored any kind of social distancing. You see the photographs of people at the seaside and in parks, etc., and it's as if the virus has actually never happened. The whole discipline in this country is breaking down, appears to be breaking down. How is the notwithstanding the fact that there's a second wave now as a result of the lockdown, have people, as lockdown has been loosened, have people by and large, Israeli public, continued to be law-abiding in this regard, or have you noticed there as well that the moment a bit of leeway was given, everybody simply flung the rules overboard and got on with their lives as if nothing had happened?
So I don't think it's as stark as I've seen it in the UK. I definitely think that human nature has let their guard down, and people have become more relaxed. But we haven't seen the same scenes as we've seen, obviously, the recent demonstrators in the UK. Even when there have been political protests, there have been kind of demarcations on the floor to make sure that people are staying 2 meters away from each other and sticking to those. The beaches, etc., and some of the nightclubs, there have been cases where, as you say, kind of the younger population have been far less concerned with keeping up the social distancing and listening to the rules. So I think it's not as bad as again, maybe I'm wrong about the UK, but I think you're still seeing a fair amount of people in masks, etc., and kind of and maintaining their discipline. But there's no doubt that it is waning as well. But perhaps this will change now with the second wave.
As a point of interest, since you mentioned, protests, etc., have there been protests, the George Floyd Black Lives Matter? How's that been dealt with in Israel? Is this an issue there, or is it simply bypassed them?
I don't think it's captivated the public's attention in the same degree that it has in the UK. But it has. I mean, there was a big demonstration on Motzei Shabbat on Saturday night in Tel Aviv in Rabin Square, which was essentially protesting the annexation. But within that context, there were other people that were kind of were having the banners of Black Lives Matter, etc. And if you remember the case of just a few months ago when a young Ethiopian Israeli was killed, there are some of the Ethiopian community that have also attached onto this and kind of had some resonance with that, and also the tragic killing last week by the border policeman in Jerusalem of this autistic Palestinian. There have been those connections made and a commonality made in that struggle as well, but it hasn't been as pervasive. I should also say that unlike the UK, because we are a Jewish country here, we don't have statues. So there's no statues that can be defaced.
And sometimes it's a long way to schlep it to the sea to throw it overboard, and not a river, lakes or rivers either. So local issues in relation to abuse and of race, etc., are more important, seem to grab young people more than some of the international issues. Is that what we're hearing from you?
Probably yes. I mean, I think there is. I mean, as I said, there are some of these social movements that are trying to make a connection and kind of be a little bit catch-all. But I don't think it's resonated to the same degree as I've seen it kind of through the UK media on social media as well.
Okay. Just before we move away from the corona, some of the issues over here about transport, about social distancing and offices of the future, how offices are going to be changed, you know, in terms of movement and seating and one way in, one way out, etc. Let's put shuls aside for the moment because they're a different story altogether. But let's talk about the workforce, about traveling to work, etc. On buses, on the light railway. How's that working in Israel, and to what extent is it working, and to what extent is it thought through? Are people observing social distancing, etc.?
So the buses are operating. It is an issue. What they've done here is they've cordoned off the area around the driver, so that the driver has a 2 meter gap, and the front seat is not available. After that, it's really at the discretion of the passengers of how much they're able to keep separate. I will say that the trains, one of the issues here is to get the trains haven't yet started running. And they were due to start this week, and again, it's one of those issues that has had the cabinet split over the issue because of this second wave. They've now decided to delay the starting of the functioning train service, and as you said, kind of the clash between that and the economic necessity of to get people to the workplace. That's where the tension is.
Okay. Let's come back to some of the political considerations over here and some of the challenges that face Israel now. And by the way, just a reminder to everybody listening, listening to Richard is really fascinating, and I see that people are so taken with the things that he has to say that nobody is asking any questions. They're just very happy and to hear him and to hear him speak. But if you do want to ask questions, this is the time to do it. Put up your chats, etc., so we can put them to Richard as we go along. So let's come back to some of the political issues over here. The whole business over here of the rotation between the prime ministers, this extraordinary situation with this very, very detailed legal document that dots every I and crosses every T, etc. Richard, is it going to work? Is Bibi going to give up his position and allow a man with whom he has now been forced to sit to take over the position that he has held for so many years, which clearly is so important to him?
Well, I would say from Netanyahu's perspective, the most important clause which suggests that he will honor it is because after the 18-month rotation when Benny Gantz serves, according to the deal, Netanyahu will serve for an additional 6 months after that. and then Benny Gantz for a final 6 months. So I think if ever there was an incentive and a reason for Netanyahu to keep up the deal, then I think it's the fact that he gets to become prime minister again for a further 6 months at the end. And I would not put any money, if we get to that stage, I certainly wouldn't put any money on Benny Gantz serving his second 6 months. That's for sure. But I also think that within the Likud and the leadership, he's also, there are incentives of certain senior Likud people that also get a promotion when Benny Gantz takes over. I think the first name that comes to mind is Miri Regev, who we just talked about, is the current transport minister, and she's due to become the foreign minister under Benny Gantz, and she has a strong and powerful connection within the Likud party that will obviously then see it in her interest also to see through the deal. Honestly, I think it's far too early to predict. I mean, Israeli governments generally have a short life, even when they're not as complicated as the deal that we have in this case. There are a great deal of uncertainties and variables that can still come through that can mean that the government could collapse at any given moment in the future. But as I said, 3 weeks in, so far it's holding strong.
What are the big issues that are looming that might cause the government to come unstuck?
So I think the first big issue, which we haven't discussed yet, is the issue of annexation.
Exactly where we want to go, right?
Yeah. So this was the only issue. By the way, the part of the formulation of the coalition government, of this national unity government, was that for the first 6 months, the only issue that would be legislated would be Corona, and both from the economic and the health sectors, with the exception being the issue of annexation, which also, unlike everything else, which has to be done in consensus between the two Bennetts, between Netanyahu and Gantz, the deal according to the coalition agreement on annexation is that Benny Gantz wouldn't have a veto over that, although he did get two significant stipulations added in. One, that it would be done in consensus with and with agreement with the US government, and the second, that it would respect the issue of previous peace treaties and regional stability as well, which is basically a coded word for the longevity and safety of the Jordanian Hashemite kingdom, to protect those. So they're the two issues that the Gantz would be, as it's stated, is most concerned about. There is a scenario that if Netanyahu gets what he wants, and the truth is, this is standing here today, the 8th or 9th of June, excuse me. We don't really know yet what Netanyahu, his end game really is. We can speculate and we can talk about scenarios, but at the moment, and BICOM has written about this on numerous occasions, we're still waiting for the Israel-US Joint Mapping Committee to issue their map and to decide exactly what the full extent of the annexation would be, where the lines will be drawn, what is the depth, what is the effects of of the implementation of it, or whether it's just declaratory. All this is still kind of unknown, and again, we can get into more details if you're interested and talk through some of those scenarios.
Please do. We really are interested to hear a bit more about this. Okay.
So I mean, I'll say two other kind of framing comments about the annexation of where this has come from. I think there are two roots within the Israeli political discourse where this is from. First of it is driven by the Israeli right wing. Fascinating, over I'd say post Gaza disengagement, which happened in 2005, there was a decision made by the settler leadership that it was too much of bad messaging just to be against everything, to be against Oslo, to be against the Palestinian state, to be against disengagement, and they had to find a positive message to push this through. And so that was where the Sovereignty Now movement was born, which says, that enough of this for over 50 years since Israel has been in control of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria. It's about time for Israel to establish its permanent final borders. And that's kind of is the consensus, which melds both that right-wing view and the view of general practitioners in previous peace processes, that although they have failed, has always understood that that Israel would never return to 67 lines, that was untenable, and that within a broad scope of the Israeli consensus were the what's referred to as the settlement blocks, primarily the Gush Etzion block south of Jerusalem, Ma'ale Adumim to the north of Jerusalem, the Ariel salient, which dips quite deep into the West Bank, but also is considered a block because it has a population of over 20,000 people, and the Jordan Valley was also kind of within the consensus of Israeli society. Also, by the way, going back for decades. For decades amongst Labour governments that also understood the necessity to be in have a long-term presence, a security presence at the very least along the Jordan Valley. What's fascinating now in the last 2 or 3 weeks of the debate is that the most vocal people against the deal are actually some of the harder line and more extreme settler community, and they
simply
object
because
to the
it
deal
doesn't give them the whole of Israel. They will settle for nothing less.
Again, that's for some people. But others are picking the specific weaknesses and dangers within this specific deal. So, for example, there is a great concern, as you allude to, that the Trump deal that this is based on says that in 4 years' time there would be a Palestinian state on roughly 70% of the West Bank. Also with land swaps as well over the Negev, which gets quite complicated, but we're not there yet. But even in principle, because what the right wing settlers are afraid of is if they consent, even if they say, okay, well, this deal is too good to be true, and and we should accept it anyway, they're worried that a future left-wing government will say, oh, but even you acquiesced to the Trump deal and consented to the formation of a Palestinian state one day, and that would lead it to be a fait accompli. So they want to stay, in their perspective, ideologically pure and not give into that concession, even though it's only a theoretical concession at this stage. The other objections that they have are over this map, and again, as I said, caution that we don't know the details of the map. We only have this very kind of basic map that was presented in January by Trump. But in that map, it talks about 15 enclaves of about 19 settlements, 20,000 people roughly, that would then be cut off from the not included in the annexation, and then cut off somehow, surrounded one day by a Palestinian state with only one exit road that may or may not be controlled by Israel. Again, these details are not clear, but they would be worried that in the areas that weren't annexed, or the sovereignty wasn't extended to those areas, that there would then be a settlement freeze in those areas, and that would stop the natural spread of and fruition of productive and healthy living in those areas, compounded by the security threat being surrounded by the Palestinian areas. It's even more complicated in the southern Judea around the Hebron Hills area, because the road number 60 that now connects Hebron to Yerushalayim would then become part of a Palestinian area. So for Hebronites and the places in Kiryat Arba with 7,500 people that are used to driving 30 miles, 20 minutes up the road to Jerusalem, would have to drive south basically via almost and all the way round the area. That would be a very unnecessarily excessive route.
So we asked for detail, and you gave it to us in spades. It's really amazing stuff. It's hugely complex. Where does the majority of the electorate, not the ones who are on the far right, but the people who are living in the coastal plains, Tel Aviv, all the way down, etc., where do they stand on annexation? Do they broadly back it? Do they see this as a moment of opportunity, so long as President Trump is in office, to settle some of these issues now? Or is there still huge ideological angst about occupying, taking over parts of the West Bank in terms of the balance of Arab to Israeli population, etc.? Presumably, the Prime Minister needs to take a steer in some form or another from the general population, from the polls. What are they saying?
So the polls, there was actually a poll that just came out this evening. It was pretty inconclusive because I've seen other polls that have contradicted this one. So again, a similar caveat to the Knesset polling. I would be a little bit careful in reading too much into these polls. But the numbers, I haven't got them in front of me, roughly said about 40% were against it. The kind of don't. I mean, again, I'm giving my own commentary of why they would be against it, because they don't see the kind of the situation would change, would improve, and there are just other inherent risks involved. About 30 or so were in favour, and then about the other 25-30% just didn't know / didn't care. I have to say that when people are asking another poll about kind of where people's kind of most concerns are, it's overwhelmingly on the economic sphere and on corona that we've already discussed, and this is very low down in people's priority of the regular population. It hasn't really I think it's got more excitement outside of Israel even than it has on the coastal plain, let's say. That it
and yet it could, if it's implemented, it could have a huge consequences, security risks for Israel if it leads to further unrest, etc. We don't know how the Arab world will treat it. Are you aware of any kind of backroom discussions, Ben Leon is asking, with the rest of the Arab world, taking their temperature from them as to how they would react to Israel's annexation?
Well, I've said this before. Israel sees the kind of Israeli government relations with the Arab world are described as a double-decker bus. And what we see in the public is only what's going on the top level. But on the bottom level, there is a whole range of a slew of conversations that go on the whole time without a public sight. Most of these revolve around, there are kind of three commonalities between Israel and the what's referred to as kind of the pragmatic Sunni world. The first is obviously about Iran, that there's shared agenda over Iran. And again, we can come back and talk about that. The other is the shared concern over Sunni extremism, jihadi groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc., which is a shared concern. And the third is a perception, and this, by the way, dates back even when President Obama was in the White House, over a perceived retrenchment of US presence in the region. And by the way, I think for all the kind of the stark differences between Trump and Obama, and most significantly Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, there is still, in terms of the presence of US leadership and a power posture, there is a similar idea that I think Trump is also, as we know him as kind of as America First guy, that also wants to pull out. Having said all that, when it comes to the, I can only speculate that conversations have gone on about this and reaching some understanding, and there are some Israeli political commentators that suggest ignore all the kind of the public criticism and condemnations that will come from the Arab world, because privately they are giving a nudge and a wink, and they're not too bothered about it. That might be true. That may be wishful thinking as well. I think more significantly, when it comes to the story of annexation, the extension of sovereignty, is how hard the US are really pushing it. I mean, obviously the US right now have got so much more on their plate. Who knows if they still have the bandwidth to deal with this? But the question is kind of whether they are still insistent on this, according to the Trump vision of the so-called deal of the century, and whether they are also putting pressure on the pragmatic Sunni states also to fall into line, and whether they can be given incentives elsewhere. By the way, the joke going around here at the moment, I'll just tell you a quick joke that it was not so funny. But the idea that the annexation would cause would cause an intifada, people were expecting that to be in Nablus and not on Fifth Avenue.
But there really are two narratives around this whole issue of annexation. Narrative number one is that this is an Eit Ratzon. It's an auspicious moment. You've got an American president and who is apparently, favorable, pushing a plan to settle the matter also once and for all kinds of complex reasons which we don't go into here, but we have America on side. The rest of the world is completely taken up, distracted by issues relating to their economies, to the coronavirus, etc. The whole issues relating to the Middle East, to the obsession that the world has with the Middle East is simply gone on holiday for a little while. The world's attention is not on Israel and not on the Arabs. You've got the issues relating to concerns about Iran. All of that creates the perfect moment, mindful of the fact that there's an American election coming up, and given the swift change of circumstances in America as a result of their economic fallout from Corona, it may be that President Trump doesn't get a second term. Nobody knows that at the moment. So this is the moment, the historic moment, to do what needs to be done in regard to annexation. And that's one narrative. And the second narrative is that this is, after all, Bibi Netanyahu. It's the consummate politician. It's not actually about anything that he wants for himself at all, that he sees that is important, because he's always held a kind of status quo, playing his cards very carefully, keeping everything in balance. And this whole issue was because of the pressure from the right. He has a perfect excuse to pull out of it now if he wants to, because as one of our, Michael Zaloof, who's sent his chat in over here, if the people on the right are against, are saying we don't want it, he's got the perfect out. So we don't know which of these two narratives it is. Does Bibi really want this? Is this an eight ratzon for Israel and it's time for him to do the deal? Or is it just a political kind of game that has to be played and it'll never come to anything? And I just wonder whether maybe I've put it too starkly, or perhaps I've put it incorrectly, but we'd like your clarity on this.
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, I think the way you just summed that up was a very eloquent and accurate picture of those two schools of thought. And I think people viscerating between the two, that they are both compelling and reasonable, and the truth is probably somewhere in between the two. This could well be the moment of truth. Although I would draw people's attention to the Jerusalem Post editorial this week, written by my friend Yaakov Katz, the editor, that kind of made the comparison between the way that Begin referred to the extension of sovereignty in 1980 over the Golan Heights, that said that without any of the chatter and pre-preparation, he saw a moment of opportunity when the international community were busy with other issues, and within a day he brought it through to the Knesset and then brought it through as a fait accompli. We're not there here. Clearly, we've been talking about it for months, and so the ability for an Israeli government to act swiftly like that, this is a very different terrain in which we're operating. And again, the law of unintended consequences of what can fall out from this is obviously a great concern. I'll just throw another a very conspiratorial idea into all this, is that this is very useful. If you listen to what the speech that the Netanyahu made when he was on the steps of the courthouse 3 weeks ago, just before his trial started, he framed it as his whole trial as a setup of the deep state in his interpretation of the media, the judicial system, and others that were basically conspiring against the whole of the right wing, that weren't letting them govern. And now we've heard this school of thought before. I mean, with the exception kind of since 1977 and the Ma'apach, the revolution when Begin came to power, ending the rule of the Labour Party, there are many conservative-minded and Likud supporters that say that this is an accurate analysis of the Israeli system, that both the military, the judiciary, and the media, three kind of huge bastions within Israeli society, are all centre-left leaning and don't allow the right to govern properly. So Netanyahu ratcheted this up and kind of framed it that what they're trying to do in this whole trial is a picture against him and to stop him leading. And so if annexation doesn't happen, it could be used as an excuse to blame those darker forces at work that perhaps interceded on their behalf to prevent Netanyahu delivering his legacy.
That's fascinating. But is the trial actually going to have any impact it's clearly going to run and run. There'll be appeals one way or another. It's not going to be settled for a very long time. What is the real, apart from reputational, what are the real implications of having a prime minister who is on trial in the country while he's still in office?
Well, I mean, I think first and foremost, it is about moral leadership. That that we're meant to be a light into the nations, and so it's not really it doesn't really sit comfortably with a lot of people that we have a prime minister who is under indictment. It's just not the done thing, and not appropriate. He's able to do that through kind of through a very specific reading of the current kind of non-constitution, but what we have here are the basic laws that outline it, that a minister can't serve, but a prime minister can. No one really thought when they founded these rules that this would be a realistic scenario that we would find ourselves in. Having said that, the other side of the coin is that this is a moment of the Israeli the judicial system to shine, that everyone is equal above the law, even if you are prime minister, even if you are an immensely talented prime minister and the longest serving prime minister in the country, still you will be brought to trial, and you are innocent until proven guilty, to run your case and to run it through.
As always, there are two sides, and each side will take the side that they want. We're coming to the end of our allotted time, Richard, and just want to touch on your own role in the work of BICOM and what it is that BICOM, the influence that BICOM have in Israel and in the United Kingdom at this point in time. A lot of our people, a lot of our viewers tonight will really not know very much about BICOM. And many years ago, Poye Zabledovich, who was a member of our community and who was the founder of BICOM, or one of the founders of BICOM, told me that the success of BICOM is, if you hear about what BICOM has done, it's failed. Its success lies in the things that it does behind the scenes that people don't know about, the influence that it has. Tell us just very briefly about where the influence of BICOM lies and just how influential it might be.
So thank you for the opportunity to talk a little bit about our work. I think that to a large extent remains true, that we try not to be the story itself. BICOM is Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, and so as the name suggests, we do both communications and research. We produce research. We produce on a 3 times a week a news update, which people are welcome to subscribe to. But it is targeted to our audiences. When BICOM was set up during the Second Intifada in 2001 to really readdress the media bias, and we targeted as our top priority senior journalists, on foreign editors, the correspondents that are based here that I work with very, very closely, diplomatic, security, Middle East editors, as well as broadly other journalists in the commentariat and opinion pages, and we work in a regular contact with these journalists, kind of providing them with briefings. In a pre-corona world, one of the most impactful work that we did, which I led here, was to bring delegations of journalists. And I said, since just journalists, we've also broadened out to other policy audiences, politicians, policy advisors, think tanks and academics, to show them, and bringing them here is really the finest, the best way to do it, because
where are you on the spectrum? Are you center right, center left, far right, far left? Are you always promoting the view of the current government?
So hopefully you've got an idea from our discussion tonight that we try and be as impartial as possible. We're not the embassy that do some great work. So we don't have to be the spokespeople of the government. We see ourselves as representing Israel more broadly. And so when, for example, we bring people to Israel and I take them into the Knesset, they will meet with left-wing, right-wing and centre politicians, because my agenda is to promote Israel as a vibrant democracy and to show the sophistication and level of the debate inside. So that's what we do. We produce our research in four main spheres: Israeli internal politics, Israeli relations with the Palestinians, and broader regional security issues. And the fourth issue that is kind of our concern and passion is a focus on the bilateral relationship between Britain and Israel. And I would say that although kind of, you know, success has many fathers, since the period of BICOM, we are appreciating and enjoying the most kind of productive and developed relationship I think that we've ever had between Britain and Israel, at least on a government to government level, and I think that's represented through the through the broad populations as well.
And are your research papers available to the general public? If some of our viewers tonight would like to sign up to them and receive them, is this available to them?
Absolutely, we do most of our material is available on our website at bicom.org.uk. We've produced a couple of recent pieces of analysis. One was on the formation of the government. One was on Netanyahu's trial, and the next one will be coming out in the next few days is on the annexation issue. We also produced a very substantial 30-page document outlining the whole of the strength of the Britain-Israel relationship through cultural exchanges, through trade, science, and defence and security policy, which we produced earlier this year. Most of that, if not all of that, is on our website, and yeah, people are welcome to check it out there.
That's great. Richard, it's really been a hugely enlightening conversation. Your breadth of knowledge and a grasp of detail is really something quite special. It's very seldom that we have the opportunity to have this kind of breadth of discussion, and we're enormously grateful to you. Mindful of the fact that it is quite late for you. It's probably 11 o'clock at night now. You've got a lovely scene behind you. I'm not sure whether you're virtually outside or really outside, but we can see.
No, it's real.
It's real. I can actually see some of the leaves blowing. We're very jealous that you're sitting outside at 11 o'clock at night. We wish you a huge success in your work, and to continue to be an intellectual force in understanding the issues in Israel. And we're very, very appreciative of being able to spend the time together. But for the moment, we'd like to thank everybody for participating, and my apologies to any of you whose questions were not answered. I didn't want to lose some of the thrust of the conversation and deviate into other areas. So that's the main reason why we didn't look at them. But please God, there'll be other opportunities to be able to speak to Richard again in the future. We'd love to have you back again.
For sure, with pleasure.
And if the annexation goes ahead, we've booked you already.
Very good. Very good. It was a pleasure. Very happy to come back and continue the conversation.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for watching over these so patiently over this last hour. I wish you all a good night.